Where are you coming from this afternoon?
From work. I'm heading home.
Work. Because people like you driving around here usually got something illegal in the car.
I don't have anything illegal.
You got any firearms in the vehicle? Any weapons I should know about?
No.
Because I'm smelling marijuana coming from the drugs in here. Step out of the vehicle. I'm going to search the car.
The body camera begins recording the moment the patrol car lights up the quiet highway. Red and blue reflections flicker across the pavement as a dark sedan slows down and pulls onto the shoulder. It's late in the afternoon. The sun is still hanging in the sky, but traffic has begun thinning out as commuters finish their day. A few cars pass in the opposite lane. Wind moves lightly across the open stretch of road. Inside the stopped vehicle sits a man in his early 40s. Calm. Composed. Still wearing the same dark suit jacket he had on earlier that day. A long day clearly behind him. His hands rest lightly on the steering wheel as he waits. Behind him, the patrol car door opens. Boots hit the pavement. The officer's body camera shakes slightly as he walks toward the driver's window. From a distance, nothing about the stop looks unusual. Just another traffic stop on a quiet highway. Routine. Normal. But the officer's voice changes the moment he reaches the car. "Where are you coming from this afternoon?" The driver turns slightly toward the window. "Good afternoon, officer." "That's not what I asked," the officer replies sharply. "Where are you coming from?" The man keeps his voice steady. "From work." The officer leans down slightly and shines his flashlight through the driver's window. The beam moves across the dashboard, then the center console, then the back seat, finally returning to the driver's face. "Work," the officer repeats. "In the middle of the afternoon?" "Yes." The officer studies him for a moment. Longer than necessary. "You live around here?" "Yes." "Then why are you driving around this area?" The question hangs there. Not curious, not professional, suspicious. "I'm heading home," the driver answers calmly. The officer straightens slightly. "You got ID?" "Yes." The man reaches slowly toward his jacket pocket. The officer immediately raises his voice. "Hey, slow." The driver pauses. "My wallet." "Keep your hands where I can see them." "My license is in my wallet." "Then grab it slow." The man removes the wallet carefully and hands over his license. The officer takes it. His flashlight beam lands on the card. He reads the name quietly under his breath, then looks back at the driver, then down again, then back up. "You been drinking today?" "No." "You sure?" "Yes." The officer continues staring at him, then slowly shakes his head. "You know something?" "What's that?" the driver asks calmly. "People like you usually got something going on when you're driving around here." The words sit in the air for a moment. Heavy. The driver raises an eyebrow slightly. "People like me?" "You know exactly what I mean." The officer leans closer toward the open window. "Mind telling me what you were really doing out here?" "I already did." "Well," the officer mutters, "I don't buy that." The flashlight beam sweeps across the inside of the vehicle again. Slow. Intentional. "You got any weapons in the vehicle?" "No." "No firearms?" "No." "No knives?" "No." The officer tilts his head slightly. "Because I wouldn't be surprised if you did." The driver says nothing. He simply watches the officer. Calm. Patient. The officer leans closer again. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" "For what reason?" the driver asks. "Because I'm asking you to." "That's not a reason." The officer exhales loudly. "You always this difficult?" "I'm asking for the reason." The officer taps the roof of the car with his flashlight. "You know what?" "What?" "I'm starting to smell something." The driver looks at him. "What do you mean?" The officer leans down again, nose slightly forward, then shakes his head slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought." "What exactly do you think?" the driver asks. The officer straightens up again. "I smell marijuana." The driver blinks once. "There's no marijuana in this car." "That's not what it smells like." "I don't use marijuana." "Yeah," the officer says with a quiet laugh. "That's what they all say." Before we go any further, comment where you're watching from. Let's see how far this documentary travels. Because what happens next isn't just a routine traffic stop. It's the moment suspicion turns into accusation. The officer taps the roof of the car again. Step out of the vehicle. Why? Because I smell drugs. You just said that. And that gives me probable cause. There are no drugs in this car. Then you got nothing to worry about. The driver sighs quietly. Officer, this is unnecessary. The officer leans down again. You know what's funny? What? It's always people like you who say that. The driver studies him for a moment, then slowly opens the door, stepping out onto the shoulder of the highway. The afternoon sun reflects off the side of the vehicle as passing cars move through the far lane. The officer immediately gestures toward the back of the car. Stand right there. The driver complies. The officer circles the vehicle slowly, flashlight beam moving across the interior again. The trunk, the back seat, then back toward the driver. You been around drugs today? No. You sure? Yes. Because I'm telling you right now, I smell marijuana. The driver shakes his head slightly. You're mistaken. The officer steps closer again. No, he says quietly. I think you're lying. The driver looks directly at him. I'm not. The officer crosses his arms. Funny thing is, I've seen this situation 100 times. What situation? The driver asks. Guys like you moving product around this time of day. The driver raises an eyebrow. Product? Drugs. The driver exhales slowly. You're accusing me of trafficking drugs. The officer shrugs. Something about this whole thing feels wrong. What exactly? You driving around here. You acting nervous. I'm not nervous. You refusing to answer simple questions. I answered every question. The officer steps closer again. You got anything illegal in that car? No? You sure? Yes. The officer nods slowly. Because if I find something, you won't. The officer smiles slightly. Oh, we're about to find out. He keys his radio. Dispatch. I'm conducting a vehicle search. The driver stands quietly beside the car, watching, because the officer still believes he just stopped a drug trafficker. But what he doesn't realize is that the man standing calmly beside that vehicle, the man he just accused of trafficking drugs, is not just another driver. And in a few moments, this stop is about to turn to something the officer never expected. The flashing red and blue lights continue reflecting across the side of the sedan as traffic moves slowly through the far lane. Cars pass occasionally. Some drivers glance toward the shoulder before continuing down the highway. But the situation beside the stopped vehicle has already begun to change, because the officer is no longer asking questions. Now he's looking for something. Anything. The body camera shifts slightly as he walks along the passenger side of the vehicle. His flashlight beam sweeps across the front seat again. Then the floor. Then the center console. Nothing. He leans down and checks beneath the seat. Still nothing. But instead of stepping back, he shakes his head slowly. You guys are getting smarter. The driver watches quietly from beside the car. What do you mean? The officer straightens up. You don't leave it in plain sight anymore. I told you there are no drugs in the car, the driver replies calmly. The officer smirks. Yeah, sure. He walks toward the rear of the vehicle and opens the back door. The flashlight beam moves across the empty seat. Then the floor behind the driver. Still nothing. But that doesn't stop him. Instead, he walks toward the trunk. Pop the trunk, he says. The driver presses the button from inside the car. The trunk opens slowly. Inside, a briefcase, a folded suit jacket, and a stack of neatly organized documents. The officer lifts the briefcase and places it on the edge of the trunk. What's in here? Work files, the driver replies. The officer opens it anyway. Folders. Legal paperwork. Documents stacked neatly in sections. He flips through them carelessly. You a lawyer or something? The officer asks. I work in law enforcement. The officer snorts. Yeah, right. He tosses the papers back into the briefcase and shuts it. You know something funny? He says. What? You guys always have the same story. What story? Professional job. Working late. Heading home? The driver says nothing. He simply watches the officer. Because the situation is becoming more obvious with every passing minute. The officer leans closer again. But then we open the trunk. And boom! What? Drugs. The driver shakes his head slowly. You're not going to find any. The officer studies him again. Longer this time. Then speaks quietly. You know why I stopped you today? No. Because something about you didn't look right. What exactly? The officer gestures toward the car. This whole thing. What whole thing? You driving around this area? And acting like you belong here. The driver's expression tightens slightly. I do belong here. The officer chuckles. Yeah, okay. Then he steps closer again. You know how many times I've seen this situation before? No? Same kind of car. Same calm attitude. Same story. And what a situation is that? The driver asks. The officer lowers his voice. Drug runners. The driver exhales slowly. I'm not trafficking drugs. That's what they all say. I already told you. The officer interrupts him. No, you told me your version. And what's your version? The officer looks him up and down. My version is that you're moving something. I'm not. You're driving around here. That's not illegal. You're acting nervous. I'm not nervous. You're getting defensive. I'm answering your questions. The officer suddenly steps closer again. You know what the real problem is? What? You people think you can outsmart us. The driver studies him carefully. You people again. You heard me. The driver's tone remains calm. I've been cooperative this entire time. Cooperative? The officer laughs. You question my reason for the stop. Because you didn't give one. You hesitated when I asked for ID. I reached for my wallet. You stepped out of the car slowly. You told me to step out. The officer shakes his head. You see what I mean? What? You're trying too hard to look calm. I am calm. Yeah. Yes. The officer folds his arms. Because most guys in your situation start sweating by now. The driver looks at him carefully. What situation is that? The officer gestures toward the vehicle again. A guy about to get caught. The driver folds his arms calmly. You still haven't found anything. The officer smiles slightly. Yet. He keys his radio again. Dispatch, I might need a K9 unit. The driver raises an eyebrow. For what? For a drug sniff. There are no drugs here. That's not what my nose says. The driver shakes his head slightly. You're making assumptions. No, the officer replies. I'm trusting my instincts. And what instincts are those? The officer steps closer again. The kind that tell me when someone is lying. I'm not lying. We'll see. Another car passes slowly down the highway. Its headlights sweep across the scene for a moment before disappearing. The driver stands still, patient, calm, watching everything unfold. Because the officer still believes he's in control, still believes he just caught a trafficker, still believes the search will eventually prove him right. But what the officer doesn't realize is that every accusation he's making, every assumption, and every word about people like you is being captured on his own body camera. And in just a few moments, he's about to learn that the man standing calmly beside that car works for an agency that investigates cases exactly like this. The patrol lights continue flashing across the highway shoulder. Cars move past in the far lane, slowing slightly as drivers notice the stop before continuing down the road. But the atmosphere beside the sedan has changed. Because now the officer isn't just searching. He's trying to prove something. The body camera tilts slightly as he closes the trunk again and walks back toward the driver. Still empty-handed. Still convinced he's right. You know what this looks like to me? The officer says. The driver remains calm. What does it look like? The officer gestures toward the car. A guy who got lucky. Lucky? Yeah, the officer replies. Lucky I pulled you over before you made the drop. The driver exhales slowly. You're still insisting I'm trafficking drugs. The officer shrugs. Something about you still doesn't sit right. What exactly? You driving alone. It's the afternoon. You coming from work. That's correct? You acting calm. I am calm. The officer laughs quietly. Too calm. The driver studies him carefully, then speaks evenly. Officer, you've searched my vehicle. Yeah? You opened my trunk. Yes. You went through my briefcase. Yes. You checked the seats and floorboards. Yes. And you still haven't found anything. The officer folds his arms. That doesn't mean it's not there. The driver tilts his head slightly. You're still looking for something that doesn't exist. The officer steps closer again. You know what the real problem is? What? You people always think you're smarter than everyone else. The driver's expression changes slightly. Not angry. Not defensive. Just focused. You people again, he says quietly. You heard me. The officer gestures toward the vehicle. You think driving a nice car and wearing a suit means nobody's going to look twice. The driver remains still. I've answered your questions. Yeah, the officer replies. But you still look like someone hiding something. The driver pauses for a moment, then asks calmly, Officer, what's your name? The officer taps his badge. Daniels. Officer Daniels. That's right. Okay. The officer narrows his eyes. Why? The driver slowly reaches toward his jacket pocket. Immediately the officer reacts. Hey, hands where I can see them. I'm retrieving identification. You already gave me your license. Yes. This is different. The officer hesitates. Slow. The driver carefully removes a small leather wallet. He opens it, then turns it slightly so the officer can see inside. For a moment, the officer doesn't understand what he's looking at. Then his flashlight beam lands directly on the badge inside. Gold. Official. Stamped. The officer leans closer, reading. His expression changes instantly, because the words on the credential are unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent. The officer blinks. Once, then again. What? The driver closes the wallet slowly. My name is Special Agent Marcus Ellington. The highway suddenly feels quiet. The flashing lights continue. Cars continue passing. But the tension in the air shifts instantly. The officer stares at him. You're FBI? Yes? The officer clears his throat. Well, that would have been useful information earlier. Agent Ellington looks directly at him. You never asked. You could have said something. You never asked. The officer glances down toward the body camera attached to his chest. Still blinking. Still recording. Every second. You understand how this looked, the officer says weakly. Agent Ellington tilts his head slightly. No? You driving around here? I was leaving work. You acting nervous. I wasn't. You refusing questions. I answered every question. The officer shifts his weight uncomfortably. You said you worked in law enforcement. That was accurate. You didn't say you were FBI. You didn't ask. The officer runs a hand across the back of his neck. You can understand why I'd be suspicious. Agent Ellington studies him calmly. You accused me of trafficking drugs. The officer says nothing. You said people like me move product around this area. Silence. You suggested I was armed. Silence again. You searched my vehicle without evidence. The officer glances down at the body camera once more. The blinking red light suddenly feels much heavier, because now he understands something very important. Every word he said, every accusation, every assumption about people like you has been recorded. Agent Ellington gestures toward the camera. Good thing you're wearing that. The officer instinctively touches the device. You stopped me because something about me didn't look right, the agent continues. That's not... You said it. The officer looks down at the pavement, because the power in the situation has completely shifted. 10 minutes ago, he believed he had caught a drug trafficker. Now, he's standing beside an FBI agent explaining why he racially profiled him on the side of the highway. And everything, every second, is on camera. Agent Ellington folds his arms calmly. Officer Daniels? Yes? You said something earlier? What? You said you trusted your instincts. The officer nods slowly. Yes. Agent Ellington looks directly at him. Well, now those instincts are going to be reviewed. The officer blinks. Reviewed? Yes. By who? The agent answers quietly. Internal Affairs. Then he pauses. And by federal attorneys. The officer's face tightens. Because in that moment, he realizes the traffic stop is no longer just a traffic stop. It's evidence. And the camera never stopped recording. And if you're enjoying this documentary so far, like and subscribe. Because what happens next doesn't just expose one officer's mistake. It shows exactly what accountability looks like when the camera never stops recording. For several seconds, neither man says anything. The flashing patrol lights continue reflecting across the highway shoulder. Cars move through the far lane, drivers slowing slightly as they pass the traffic stop before continuing on their way. But the situation beside the sedan has completely changed. 10 minutes earlier, Officer Daniels believed he had stopped the drug trafficker. Now he's standing in front of a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent, realizing that every accusation he made is permanently recorded on his own body camera. And the camera never stopped recording. Officer Daniels clears his throat. Well, if I had known, Agent Ellington interrupts calmly. That's exactly the problem. The officer blinks. What do you mean? You shouldn't have needed to know who I was. Silence settles between them again. You accused me of trafficking drugs, the agent continues. You searched my vehicle without evidence. You repeatedly referred to people like you. The officer shifts his weight uncomfortably. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you said. Agent Ellington gestures toward the blinking camera on the officer's chest. And it's all recorded. The officer instinctively glances down at the device. The red recording light suddenly feels much heavier, because he now understands something very important. The footage does not belong to him anymore. It belongs to the department, to investigators, to lawyers, to a courtroom, and eventually, possibly to the public. Agent Ellington continues speaking calmly. You detained me without probable cause. You searched my property without legal justification. You suggested I was armed. You implied I was trafficking drugs. And you did it while making racially charged assumptions. The officer exhales slowly. You're making this sound worse than it is. Agent Ellington looks directly at him. No. You already did that. Another car passes on the highway. The headlights sweep briefly across both men before disappearing again. The officer rubs the back of his neck. So what happens now? He asks quietly. The agent answers without raising his voice. Now this incident will be reviewed. Reviewed by who? Internal Affairs. The officer swallows. And? Agent Ellington pauses. And by federal attorneys. The officer's expression tightens. You're filing a complaint? Yes. And a civil rights lawsuit. The officer shakes his white head slightly. This is getting blown out of proportion. Agent Ellington tilts his head. Is it? You stopped me because something about me didn't look right. You assumed I was trafficking drugs. You repeatedly used the phrase people like you. And you searched my vehicle based on a smell you cannot prove. The officer says nothing. Because the camera recorded all of it. Agent Ellington continues calmly. You said you trusted your instincts. Yes. Well, those instincts are now evidence. The officer exhales heavily. Within hours of the traffic stop, the body camera footage is uploaded to the department system. Every second of the encounter becomes part of an official record. The stop, the accusations, the search, The comments about people like you? Internal Affairs opens an investigation almost immediately. Investigators review the footage frame by frame. There is no confusion, no missing context, no misunderstanding. Everything is clear. The officer initiated a search without valid probable cause. He made repeated, racially suggestive statements. And he escalated a routine stop into an unlawful investigation. Within 2 weeks, Officer Daniels is placed on administrative suspension. Within 30 days, the department announces the official outcome. Officer Daniels is terminated from the police force. The department releases a formal statement. Officer Daniels violated departmental policies regarding unlawful search procedures, professional conduct, and bias-based policing. But the consequences do not stop there. 3 months later, Agent Ellington files a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and the police department. The case cites several legal violations, including Fourth Amendment unlawful search and detention, violation of federal civil rights protections, racial profiling and discriminatory policing, misuse of authority during a traffic stop, and the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case is the officer's own body camera footage. The video is clear. The words are clear. The assumptions are clear. After months of legal proceedings, the city reaches a settlement. Millions of dollars. Civil rights attorneys begin analyzing the footage. Because the video shows something important: how quickly assumptions can turn into accusations, and how quickly accusations can turn into violations of the law. Training departments across the region begin reviewing the footage. The stop becomes an example used during internal policy discussions. A reminder that a routine traffic stop can change in seconds, when bias replaces evidence. But Agent Ellington makes one thing very clear during the final statement released to the public. This case was never about money. It was about accountability. Nearly a year later, the same highway looks exactly the same. Cars drive past. Traffic lights blink in the distance. Police cruisers still patrol the road. Routine. Normal. But one thing about that road has changed forever. Because the lesson from that afternoon remains impossible to ignore. Assumptions can turn into accusations. Accusations can turn into violations. And when those violations are recorded, accountability becomes unavoidable. Because sometimes, all it takes is one traffic stop, one officer who believes he already knows the answer, and one camera that never stops recording, to expose the truth. Do you think the officer would have acted the same way if he knew the driver was FBI? Comment what you think. The end.